And so it's important to nurture, recognize, and not deny, but really, truly nurture these parts of ourselves that are there for a reason, evolutionarily. And when we nurture them, what we find is that we tap into and awaken that opportunity to start to realize what we actually can be and who we can be as people.
Dr. Dave Rabin joins us on this week's podcast. Hi, I'm your host, Paul Austin, and I brought in Dr. Dave this week to talk about the intersection of science and spirituality in psychedelic medicine. Dave actually did an event with us a couple months before this interview, an event in late May in San Francisco. He was on a panel that we had about how to hack altered states of consciousness because he's created this device which uses vibrations called Apollo on your wrist or on your ankle to facilitate certain states of being. It's really fascinating. The research they're doing is really interesting. I've tried it myself. I love it. It works. It's effective. And so I had to get Dave on the podcast to just go deeper into what plays a role from an epigenetic perspective in helping us to heal, and how does the mystical experience help with that healing process. So we get pretty technical. Dave's a psychiatrist. He's very knowledgeable, so we get pretty technical about the serotonin system, but we also talk about Dave's new project called Modern Spirit, where they're collaborating with MAPS. It's Dave, Dr. Joe Tafur, and a couple others who are collaborating with MAPS to carry out the largest epigenetic study to date. And they're actually raising fundraising for that as well at Modern Spirit. So Dave has two great, interesting projects going on, Apollo and Modern Spirit. We'll include links to both of those on the website if you want to check them out. And this conversation was absolutely riveting. He came over to the place that I was staying at in Berkeley back, I think we recorded this in August, and we sat in the back garden with a bunch of bees and just chatted for like an hour, hour and a half about where science and spirituality meet. So without any further ado, I will bring you Dr. Dave Rabin. Dave, I just want to welcome you to the Third Wave Podcast. Came all the way out here to Berkeley to sit down and talk about Apollo, to talk about the psychedelic epigenetic study that you're working on, to talk about your personal story. So I'm just excited to really dig in. And
thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This is going to be a lot of fun.
This will be a lot of fun. So let's just start with you and a little bit about your story, just so our audience has at least some context. The projects that you're working on right now, one of which is an epigenetic study with MAPS, another of which is a startup that you're working on called Apollo, which uses vibrations to help synchronize people's attention and kind of how they're directing it. What started you on this path? What brought you to this point in time? What are maybe just three key things that have led you to where you are now?
Sure. So I guess I'm a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist by training, and I've spent a lot of time and interest over the last 12 years studying chronic stress and resilience, and effectively what makes some of us overcome very, very intense stress and be better off for it, and then others of us who have very intense stress, or maybe not even as intense stress, and don't recover, don't grow from it, and find themselves being held back by it, and in physical and mental health. And so I started looking at that. And in addition, when I was growing up, I also was very interested in dreams. And dreams were something that really fascinated me because I had very, very vivid dreams growing up. So vivid, positive and negative, that sometimes I found myself not being able to recall whether or not it had actually happened. And that really threw me for a loop, because everything that everybody was telling me was that the only real world was the world that I saw with my open waking eyes when I was awake. And then I had these experiences that were altogether extraordinarily real, but they happened while I was asleep, and nobody could really tell me anything about them. And being, naturally inquisitive, because my parents are doctors and researchers, and they, sort of like inculcated this like natural sense of curiosity in me from a very young age, I just started thinking about this all the time. And that somehow over time led into the study of chronic stress and resilience. And I think partially that was the case because when you're stressed out and when you're having hard times, especially as an adult, we oftentimes know that our dreams change, and we start to have different experiences that manifest in our subconscious at times during the day, but definitely at night. And it can interfere with our sleep, and it can interfere with our ability to recover sometimes if they're recurrent nightmares. But other times, when we process what happens in those dreams and talk about it with others, or write it down and journal and reflect on it, these are things that actually do have real purpose and meaning in our lives. They're there for a reason, especially when they recur. And understanding where they come from and getting them out and just sort of reflecting on the meaning of those things and what they could mean in your life. And by meaning, I mean metaphorical meaning, because dreams occur in metaphors and our brain works in metaphors and associations. And it's a sort of rhythm of how we learn things. And so all of this stuff kind of led me into psychedelics, because psychedelics are an incredibly powerful medicine that is really breakthrough for our time, and it's not new to our time. Many of these were discovered in the 40s and 50s,
and of course thousands of years
ago, right? In the case of plant medicine,
the first wave of psychedelics,
right? The first wave,
I like to call it,
right. In the case of like ayahuasca and psilocybin mushrooms and cacti and things like that,
Kaikian as well from ancient Greece, right?
Right.
Like Plato and
exactly,
yep, things like that.
Yep. And so, and that history is incredibly important to understand how these things used to be used, because now, oftentimes there's a stigma in thinking about that when we talk about these medicines, we call them drugs, and we talk about them as being used recreationally, which is not the way they were ever intended to be used, and for the most part, not the way they were ever written about in history. And pretty much when you look through all of human history, these things were used to build connection, build community, and they were used to facilitate healing and trauma as tools to help us enter states, either individually or with a healer or with one another, to help bring people and communities closer together and get people more on the same page, and to help people get through tough times. And so it's critically important to remember that history when we look at the way that we're now, because of MAPS and because of all this hard work Rick Doblin has done, and his group, to really pioneer and push things like MDMA push MDMA through these very rigorous FDA clinical trials to make it match the standard of every single other medicine on the market. And he's doing an amazing job, and now it's in phase 3, and we're going to see, undoubtedly positive results from that. And that's going to start to change, and really usher in, I think, the third wave of this, of this, not just a psychedelic revolution, but a revolution in thought and healing. Almost like I think it's going to be like another renaissance for humanity. I'm hopeful.
Really, and it's really like a revolution in our relationship to self. For pre-agriculture, if we go back that far, right? Like Yuval Noah Harari wrote *Sapiens* and sort of tracked this a little bit. It's like our relationship to self and our ability to cultivate relationship to self was really through like animistic traditions. And then eventually with agriculture, it became more hierarchical. There was mainstream religion, and we basically found our relationship to self through a priest or through some sort of Bible or through, whatever else it might be. And now it feels like there's this larger pattern happening where it's more and more up to the individual to develop that relationship to self and what it means. And I think that really tracks on well, when you talk about the suffering that people are going through, it feels like, to me, more than anything, it's an existential sort of suffering, an existential sort of crisis. And now we have these tools that are becoming more and more available, like psychedelics, that help us to regain that connection and reestablish that connection that previously we've just been totally, cut off from. And it seems like, in the past that, like the Gnostics, for example, it was always highly stigmatized, or kind of the people who did have that individual relationship to self were ostracized or excommunicated or whatever else it might be. And it now seems like more and more like that is going to become, quote unquote, the thing, or it's what more and more, especially the intelligentsia and business leaders and people in academia and people in medicine. In fact, I'd love to even discuss this a little bit, are moving more and more towards like, oh yeah, like spirituality and connection is really quite critical. From your work, having one foot in the science world and one foot in the spirituality world, and just picking up even on what you were talking about before, this relationship between dreams and psychedelics. There's a bee that has just landed on me. This is the great thing about doing live podcasts in random places. We're in this garden at this Airbnb that I've been living in, and they have honeybees, and the honeybees are, like 10 feet from us? And there's dozens and dozens of them. And, Dave and I are just, hundreds. Dave and I are just sitting out here hanging out with the honeybees. Anyway, I got distracted. What's that relationship between science and spirituality mean to you?
That's a great question. I think that the relationship is really centered around balance and understanding that we often live in a world of extremes and of where our brains are really, really, really good and finely tuned and honed and practiced at contrast and looking at things as black and white and looking at things as more different from us than we are similar. And when you really take a step back, especially if you're just looking at other people, you really take a step back and look at someone, and when you look at somebody, you can't help but have an immediate thought that's based on your past experience about that person, where you're going to have a biased, some expectation of that person based on something you see or experience around them before you've even talked to them, and that's normal. But what we can do about that is you can take that opportunity to ask yourself, is this person actually more different than me? Or do we actually have a lot more in common than we do different? And what you'll realize instantly is that, of course, you have more in common than you do different, because we're all human to start. And that affords us this critical knowledge of one another that is easy to ignore when you don't think about it that way. But when you think about it that way, because that's the absolute truth of the matter, and you accept that truth going into it. And Alan Watts talks a lot about this, and I really admire his work because just as an orator and somebody who's able to translate ideas, he really expresses this kind of stuff very clearly. And and one of the things that has been talked about in this area is just, understanding that when you see somebody else around you, or something else is different from you, and then this goes into the animals, right? Like thinking about the honeybees, like all of these animals going all the way back to primordial sea slugs from like 300 million years ago, they all have some of these core characteristics that we still have. They all know how to detect the difference between safety and fear and danger, right? Or they wouldn't be able to survive. And they all understand, they've evolved that, and they all understand that it's important to adapt some form of communication between one another and between themselves and the environment that allows them to be able to find food and to sometimes find shelter and build shelter. And in some cases, even with like octopi, to build and use tools underwater and things like that, which are really pretty incredible. When you think about the humans really are not that different from those animals in our most fundamental, the stuff that goes on at the center of the emotional brain and the amygdala, that's what it's doing. It's just doing these very basic reptilian activities that are just replicated all the way through the evolutionary chain. And they expand as they go through in terms of intricacies and depth and detail, and, until we get to humans where we have these incredibly complex thinking patterns and minds where we can think about anything at any time, and, and things can get totally wild. But in general, the idea is that when you can learn an incredible amount from your environment by starting to change reframe the way that you see it as more similar than different. We all, there's a saying that is a very old saying, and it's escaping me who said it. It might have been Pythagoras. It's as above, so below. And the idea is that nature is not stupid. It is efficient. It is one of the most efficient things that we've ever experienced in our whole lives, in our whole existence. And nature has purposefully constructed a very complex system that replicates itself on every level. It's why when you look at the way that cells function and the way that they have to behave to survive, it's also not that different from the way that humans have to behave to survive. It's just that we do it on an organism level composed of billions of cellular things, and they do it on a cellular level composed of less things. But it goes all the way down and all the way up. The most fundamental behaviors and the most fundamental patterns of behavior are still there at the foundation, at the core. And that's what DNA shows us. That's what Francis Crick always talked about, is DNA is like this common thing that binds all living things together in a way that connects us all, despite the fact that we have brains that are so good at seeing the disconnections. But it's up to us to practice understanding our connection to ourselves, as you said, to everything else around us, and so that we can live sustainable, healthy lives that are fulfilling and actually achieving what, our full potential. I think is
our full potential. So where do psychedelics come into this? Like, what role then do psychedelics play in helping us understand this relationship between science and spirituality?
So psychedelics are critical because they, in general, especially talking about the traditional psychedelics, they come from the earth. Ayahuasca and psilocybin and almost all the modern psychedelics, they may be altered by humans, but they come essentially from the earth.
Even LSD is partially derived from ergot, which is this fungus that grows on rye.
Yeah. Exactly. And MDMA comes from sassafras originally. And so, almost one of the only ones that doesn't actually is ketamine.
I was thinking that exact thing.
Yeah. And I think almost every other one has a very much plant-derived origin.
Mm-hmm.
So where psychedelics fit in is that, I think we were talking about meaning earlier. And we're talking about how we generate meaning from our environment and from our experiences. Every experience has the potential to be meaningful or not meaningful. Ideally, when we really think about it, we would prefer our experiences to be as meaningful as possible, as often as possible. And what that comes from is where we generate meaning. It was actually discovered very recently by Franz Wollweiter, who has done some of the most incredible work in Switzerland on psilocybin and LSD. And what he showed was something that applies well beyond psychedelics. And, he very well win the Nobel Prize for this work because he showed that when you give human subjects psilocybin or LSD, which have incredibly complex effects, and we've been studying them for over 50 years, and we know very little about how they work, but we do know that the effects are huge, right? Changes in complete ability to sense the world and everything about it and yourself, to the point where you can even have ego death and die and then be reborn as a new person, hopefully closer to where you wanted to be before.
Transformation.
Right. Exactly. The whole
rebirth.
The whole death.
The whole Stan Groff thing.
Exactly. To that and just to the end point of healing as the ideal goal. These medicines create meaning. Rather, they facilitate the body's ability to perceive meaning from the environment and from ourselves. By opening our minds, and in some ways you can think about it, at least from what we know about the neuroscience so far, like a turning off of the default mode network is like a tuning out of the ego frequencies that we typically perceive the world through, the ego filter, and then tuning in to all the other ways your brain could perceive the world.
It's kind of like when Aldous Huxley spoke about this reducing valve that the brain has, right? In order for us to actually be able to go about our day-to-day business, we need to sort of reduce our consciousness so that we don't become overwhelmed by all this extra sensory stimuli.
Exactly. Which is just a very important survival skill. It's critical that it's there, but there should also be a consistent balance, as I was saying earlier, that ties that world to very firmly and grounds it in the other world, this spiritual energy, whatever you want to call it, world. The stuff that we don't necessarily perceive with our limited consciousness. It's very important to note that psychedelics are just one tool that comes from the earth traditionally that allows us or affords us the ability to access these more meaningful states. And the work that Franz Wollweiter did that was so breakthrough was that he showed that meaning is incredibly complex. We have no idea where meaning comes from up until like 5 years ago. But we do know that psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD reliably change the way that we perceive meaning from the environment. So Franz Wollweiter said, I'm going to give you guys a drug that's orally active, that's non-toxic, but for the period of like the next 6 hours, it will prevent your 5-HT2A receptors from working well.
Is that a psychedelic?
No, it's not at all. It's probably the opposite of a psychedelic.
It's the opposite of a psychedelic.
Yeah, and typically, like it may not make you feel much of anything because it gets cleared pretty quickly. But ultimately, when you take psilocybin or LSD, what he found out was that the people who randomly took ketanserin blocked all of their effects of meaning change in LSD and psilocybin experiences, which is unbelievable because that means that one receptor system pathway sits at the top of all the other stuff that's happening in our bodies when we take these kinds of medicines that changes the way that we perceive our world and that we interpret meaning from not only the world around us, but also from ourselves. And so then the real question becomes, well, how do we know that that's not just a fluke finding and that it's actually consistent with the way that the body works? And the way we know is because we've had people taking SSRIs for 50 years almost now, or maybe 40 years. And what do we learn from SSRIs? Is that the most common side effect that people get is not being able to have orgasms anymore. And
really?
Yes, and this is not talked about as much as it should be, but that is the most common side effect that people typically get from taking SSRIs, particularly at the therapeutic dose. And that effect usually happens before they actually see benefit from the medicine. But what's really interesting about SSRIs is that we know how they work because we designed them to work in a certain way. And the way that they work is that they block reuptake of serotonin into the part of the neuron that's originally releasing it, right? And so serotonin gets released from the presynaptic terminal to the postsynaptic terminal to pass on the message that serotonin is providing. And then while serotonin, but is, a whole bunch of serotonins in the cleft, the area between the two synapses, the cell that released all the serotonin starts reuptaking serotonin because it wants to keep a balance between what's in and what's out. And so SSRIs, basically, they were designed to work, and the way they work is by blocking that reuptake on the presynaptic side, which creates a flooding that's consistent all the time inside the cleft. So the receptors are always more activated. Mm-hmm. And the most common side effect of that happening is general numbness, which correlates with this whole lack of sex drive, because not only it's great at suppressing people's ability to feel or decreasing people's sensation or pain from emotional stress and fear and depression and things like that. It does work. And anxiety, it does help in a lot of people, but it also numbs the positive, because positive and negative experiences are due to being present and in the environment and getting meaning from those environments. And they're flooding the serotonin receptors. And the reason why we get meaning is because of not just consistent activity at those receptors, but bursts of activity at those receptors, which is what LSD and psilocybin are doing. And what present experiences are likely to do. Because when you are present in an experience, whether it's on a medicine that helps facilitate access to that experience, or whether it's using Apollo, or whether it's meditating or deep breathing or in a float tank or whatever it is, you're getting more meaning out of your experience, which is why they are healing. But those experiences can also be negatively meaningful, which is trauma.
Because meaning is somewhat neutral.
Right.
Or it can be in that when you're opening up your subconscious, your unconscious, your general experience, you're both getting in touch with these higher states of being, and you're also getting in touch with these lower states of being. And this is like
strength and vulnerability.
And it's the shadow and the light. It's this, again, getting back to this metaphor of how we exist. So just to take a step back, because what we just spoke about got pretty involved. So from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand, one of the core reasons why psychedelics are so effective is because they activate the 5-HT2A receptor, which is at the quote unquote top of the hierarchy for serotonin receptors.
For meaning making.
Specifically,
not for other serotonin receptors.
But that's where a lot of the healing comes from, and the transformation is by helping us to generate more meaning from our everyday life.
And see opportunities for new meaning that we did not see the first time.
And like, what would be an example of that? If we're seeing
like in
new
the healing of
opportunities?
trauma, for example, one of the common, most common accounts that I have heard from people who have used psychedelics is that, particularly ayahuasca and psilocybin in treatment and MDMA, is that they feel that they have an opportunity, whether it's having their hand held by the therapist, or their hand held by the shaman, or their hand held by God in some cases, they say, and to basically have an opportunity, like in the cartoons when we were kids, to go back and see time dilated throughout your whole life, and actually go back and look at your past and see areas of your past which have always been there. And they're just things you may have shut out or purposefully forgotten, but they're always there because you can't just forget stuff. It's just, you can tell yourself that you have, but ultimately these things are always remembered. Every experience is recorded on your DNA in the epigenetics. And so then we know that because trauma now has been found to be encoded on the DNA. And it was this work pioneered by Rachel Yehuda from Mount Sinai, who did some incredible foundational work about showing that when in people who are traumatized, and this started with Holocaust survivors, and you looked at their ancestors, and there were the same markings on their DNA, not in the A, C's, T's, and G's, but on the little chemical markers like methyl groups and acetyl groups, and which are these small little tiny molecules that are very common, but when they get attached to certain areas of DNA, what they do is they change the way that DNA is expressed in terms of being more protein, because DNA gets made into proteins. The proteins are the functional outcome of the DNA. The proteins actually do stuff. And the DNA is the code that tells the proteins how to function. And so if the DNA gets turned up in certain places or down in certain places, or in some cases off in certain places, then what can happen is you get imbalance and dysregulation and pathology over time, chronic illness, inflammation. The body can be trained to be in an inflamed state because of trauma. And when you practice being traumatized over time, it reinforces that, it likely reinforces that coding on the DNA. And now this has been shown in mice. They actually replicated the experiment in mice, and they traumatized the first baby mouse that came out of its mother by, I think, separating from its mother and or exposing it to a cat at a very young age. And it took 4 generations of pure safety, bred from that mouse down, 4 generations minimum to get the changes to the trauma genes out. In humans, it looks like increased risk of PTSD, depression, anxiety, hoarding, metabolic disorder, diabetes. It shows in all these different ways. OCD, chronic stress. It shows in all these different ways. In mice, it shows like not interacting socially, not mating behavior properly, things like that, not raising your own pups properly. Very similar stuff, but then over time, it will breed out. But in humans, we don't have the benefit of being raised in a perfectly safe lab environment, right? So we're always recapitulating trauma. And so it's estimated by some people who work in this, experts in this field, that the trauma may actually last in humans for sometimes 14 or more generations. And so it's critical now for our healing to, really bring what we know of Western medicine and behavior training and all this great stuff that we've developed with psychiatry and psychology and psychoanalysis all these years, and combine that with what we know of Eastern medicine and spiritual practice to see where we meet eye to eye, which is actually in a lot of places we're more similar than we are different. It's just that Western medicine is really, really fantastic for treating acute illness, and Eastern medicine is really, really fantastic for treating chronic illness. But together, you can treat a whole lot more illnesses. So we want to embrace the strengths of one another and try to figure out, how to, help people recover from these kinds of conditions in a much healthier way that's more natural. That's something that they can teach themselves how to do, because you
want to empower people, you want to give people agency,
because the central place for healing is within the self, and this is ultimately now what Western medicine and Eastern medicine are both saying.
When it gets back to what we were just talking about earlier in the podcast, which is the meeting points of science and spirituality. So even though, we were talking about how, yes, we have a relationship to the animals, we have this kind of evolutionary spiral of consciousness and how, et cetera, et cetera. But what you're talking about now, it's like this beautiful marriage that we're now seeing between Western science, which is more reductionist in nature, which really tries to get to things at an atomized level, to Eastern, I wouldn't even say Eastern science, it's just like an Eastern way of being, which really looks at the holistic self. Yeah. Mind, body, spirit. What's our relationship to self? How can we heal our relationship to self? It's like, I was reading a book that Gandhi wrote, like his kind of annotated biography. And this is something that he emphasized, was the Bhagavad Gita was his text. It was basically how he built his life, was around the wisdom that's rooted in that tradition and that knowledge. And
it's our responsibility to pass that on to each other.
Exactly.
And so many things have been automated in our lives with technology, and technology is moving so fast that in some ways we've actually forgotten our responsibility to pass this information on to each other. This knowledge, it's not information, it's knowledge and wisdom. It's organized information. Wisdom being organized knowledge times time, right? Like all of these things are important things that are inherent to us. But if we're not taught how to find them, or that they don't exist, or how to, seek that knowledge and learn it, then we're not going to learn. And we're going to continue to make the same dumb decisions over and over and over again. It's that simple.
So a question came up for me, and I want to, because I love this. It's so great to chat like this.
Yeah, this is great. I'm so glad we get to hang out.
Me too. I'm really glad we get to hang out. Are you familiar with the concept of first principles?
I've heard a bit about it. Remind me.
So first principles are like the fundamental things that you should master or understand if you want to solve a problem, if you want to become great at a skill, or if you want to build a really successful business. So a couple examples for you. I attended this fantastic movement workshop. So after I did a bunch of ayahuasca at the beginning of this year, I really got into movement because I refer to Ken Wilber's work when I talk about this. Ken Wilber really talks about the next step of development being feeling awareness, developing feeling awareness, where it's like this beautiful, again, marriage combination between intuition and cognition. And that's the next stage of growth and development, is when your decisions and your initial kind of things are informed by intuition, and then you go to the brain afterwards to really is this the right decision?
Right.
Ayahuasca really allowed me to drop into my body, to understand it really well, to feel into it. And so I started doing Rolfing. You're familiar with Rolfing, structural integration. And the guy who was my Rolfer, who I need to get on the podcast, Dara, who's fantastic. If you ever go to New York, I need to connect you to, because you would hit it off.
Thank you.
He's a Rolfer, and he introduced me to movement stuff. And from a couple friends who I had spoken to the month previous, they had turned me on to Ido Portal's stuff. And then this guy turned me on to something called Fighting Monkey. And it's led by a guy named Joseph. And he was on the National Olympic basketball team for the Czech Republic. His wife is Greek and is a nationally renowned dancer. And basically what he's done to understand movement between dance and athletics and, martial arts and a number of other practices, what are the first principles of moving your feet and of, so that would be one example. What's the shared footwork between boxing and basketball and dance? And, so these are some things that we can boil it down to learn things faster and quicker. So my question for you is, as a psychiatrist and as a neuroscientist, what to you are the first principles of healing trauma?
So that's a really good question. I think the first principles of healing trauma are actually things that we've talked about for a long time as a culture, as a human culture, and that they've surfaced in lots of different ways in lots of different cultures that have not communicated with each other, but somehow shared or found the same principles. And I think, Jeremy Narby talks about this a lot, which is really, really interesting, where he's traveled the world and seen that many cultures seem to resonate with these same guidelines that they collect or learn from having what they describe in their art or in their writings as spiritual experiences that are assisted with the use of tribal medicine or not in some cases. And they all center around these generally four things, and there's some others also that get added in, but the four main ones are gratitude, forgiveness, compassion, and self-love. And the idea being that, it's fine. It's really great to think about these things towards other people, but the whole idea of what they're called the four pillars, because they're the pillars that form the foundation of trust in yourself. And so the idea is to practice them towards yourself, because we oftentimes spend too much time thinking about practicing for other people to gain love or favor from others. Transactional, right. Transactional giving, or whatever you want to call it. And of course, that's natural in a lot of ways. At the same time, it's not even close to as effective as it could be if you haven't practiced and mastered those things, those four pillars for yourself. Because once you master those things for yourself and you truly are grateful for yourself and for waking up every day and just having another opportunity to try to make the most of the day, and you are able to forgive yourself for the mistakes that you make and be compassionate for yourself and approach yourself as your best friend when something bad happens, rather than as your worst enemy or self-critic, and then able to manifest all of that in this idea of loving yourself like you would love your partner or expect your partner to love you, and giving that to yourself on a ideally moment-to-moment basis. And the more that you spend time practicing those things just by thinking about them, they start to embed themselves in your consciousness. And like our moms always said, practice makes perfect. If you do something for a long enough time, just like thinking about an idea for a long enough time, you train those synapses and those neural connections in your brain, just like we were talking about earlier, to build stronger connections so that you don't have to think about it anymore. It just becomes part of your life.
Yeah, you teach yourself. And you not only train the synapses, you also train the gut. And you train
everything. Yeah, the whole body.
The muscle memory. And you train. I mean, this is, when I read Your Body Keeps the Score, that's why that book was so impactful. And like, it's like anyone who's doing anything professionally in this work, psychedelics and healing trauma, and like that is, I think, a must read, because it really, it's kind of like what you were saying earlier. It's like everything that happens to us, we remember.
Even if it's not conscious memory,
because
it's in there somewhere.
Exactly, because the deeper wisdom that we've, again, talking about science and spirituality, this evolutionary pattern of life, the deeper wisdom within us is in our body. Because the mind is much more new. The mind is much more recent in terms of its development.
Well, and I think there's a balance between that too, right? There's a duality and there's also a singularity. And there is a place where the mind and the body meet together where we're all, one unified organism. And then sometimes we almost overly separate the two when we talk about it, but the language that we use is really important. And the way we describe ourselves, should be accurate, which is that when we talk about the body, it should include the mind. It should include
spirit.
It should include our spirit. It should include the psychological, physical, and emotional components and spiritual components of who we are. It should in fact not be limited by words at all. It should just be you, right? Because when you talk about you without attaching any other words to it, you could be anything. And that's the part that everybody seems to be missing, because I think, going back to something we were talking about earlier, is that the rhythms in our life are like, we're disconnected from the natural rhythms that we used to follow when we weren't surrounded by phones and TVs and bright lights all the time and cars and the internet and all these things that distract us weren't always there. And when humans used to live, they lived by listening to the rhythms of the wind and the water and the earth through the seasons and the sunlight and the moonlight, and all these things were tracked over time and cataloged into all of these different disciplines. One of them being astrology, and another being all these, tribal culture traditions. And the Aztecs and the Mayans had their rich traditions of this stuff. And these were like really important ways where interfaces between science and spirit, between us and the environment, were found and maintained. And there used to be a critical importance to those rhythms in nurturing us as a people, because our survival is dependent on the survival of our environment. There is and should be never be a doubt that is true.
Yeah, there's no separation.
There's no separation. If you start separating the mind and the body, you start separating us and them, and then all of a sudden it becomes very easy to doubt everything. And what we really need to do is practice retraining our brains to use these to find opportunities to see similarity rather than difference. And that is what Apollo, in a lot of ways, operationalizes. So Apollo is a technology that we developed at the University of Pittsburgh. Is it all right if I talk about this?
Yeah, let's go into it.
And so Apollo, we developed because we know that music helps people feel better, and we know that touch helps people feel better, and we know that those things help people feel better, even if they have some of the worst clinical diagnoses, physical or mental. And that when people are given certain kinds of music and certain kinds of touch, it just changes the way that their symptoms express themselves and the way that they say they feel, and even to the point where it changes their physiology. In some points, their resting heart rate and their breathing rate and all these things. And so we know this to be true, and we, as in our background, many of us were musicians growing up, or we huge music fans. We know that music made us feel different emotionally, energetically. I use different music to study than I did to fall asleep, for instance. And so we basically said, well, can we create something that we can give originally to our patients when they left the office, so that in between the therapeutic sessions where we did a ton of work, they could still feel safe by wearing something that delivered frequencies to their body that helped them be more present and helped them feel more safe by activating the safety signals in the brain through the touch receptor system, just as if somebody was there holding your hand when you're having a bad day. And having that be able to be with you all the time in such a way that it can train you and teach you the way we should have been taught by our parents and our communities, how to cope with stress in a way that we grow from it rather than letting it get us down. Stress is, and bad things are going to happen. It's just the way it is, guys.
Right, yeah.
But you can change the way you think about it from thinking, why me, to this is another challenge that I have to overcome in a successful way or as successful as I can to grow and learn from how the hell did I get myself here and never to get myself here again.
Yeah.
There's a whole critical learning process to happen.
Basically try not to personalize it.
Right.
Like the personal self can't, and it's funny, we've been talking about meaning this whole time. The personal self can't, in fact, attach too much meaning to that, at least to the experience itself.
Right.
The thing to attach meaning to is the larger purpose. It's the larger vision. It's the larger arc. It's this kind of concept of the hero's story. And oftentimes, because what I want to emphasize with what you're talking about as well, it's oftentimes just as necessary to go into the pain and feel that and experience that as it is to then go, okay, well, now what else can I do so that I don't ever experience that state of lowness again?
Yeah, I mean, if to think about it another way, to use metaphor, since that's how our brains work, it would be like every time something hard comes around, you have the opportunity to put all of your faculties, all of your mental and physical faculties into solving that problem and figuring it out, or you could literally drag yourself through it kicking and screaming. And most of the time we choose kicking and screaming.
Well, yeah, we numb ourselves to it.
And we distract ourselves from it because sometimes it's easier to just be like, oh, I'll just put it off because I don't want to do that because I have all these other things to do. And then you do it and you do it half-assed and you have to do it again. Yeah. Ultimately, that's usually what happens to all of us. I make this mistake all the time.
We all do. It's always like 2 steps forward and 1 step one step forward and 2 steps back.
But the point is that every time you have one of these experiences or any experience, you just try to learn as much as you can from it any time. Don't, not that you look at it from the standpoint of why me or please God end this so that I can go on and do something else. You look at it from the standpoint of I'm here. This is the situation. I might as well accept it so that I can get as much from it as possible. And that is what Apollo is. It's a way, it's the way that we use sound and vibration to help facilitate your body to get into the state that allows you to do that as much as possible.
Agency.
Right. And I thought what you said was very poignant actually on stage, because it's something that has been joked around to us before. When you first tried it, do you remember what you said?
No.
You said this is like wearable drugs. And on one hand, I was thinking, wow.
I did say that, yeah.
That's a great way to describe it from a general consumer marketing perspective, right? Because it's catchy and it makes sense. Like
wearable drugs.
People are
Apollo, wearable drugs. We got it. I could see your logo right now, your brand.
At the same time though, I want to make sure that people understand the language in that this is not a drug and this is not a substitute for drugs. People, it is wearable medicine, right? This is a medicine tool that we developed from all of our knowledge of Eastern and Western medicine and doing tons and tons of literature reviews over the last 5 years to put together something that we learned, that uses everything we learned to actually give people something that makes their lives better and helps them see opportunities to access their true potential. And that's what Apollo really is.
You know what you got to do with Apollo?
What?
You got to bring in a Bauhaus designer. A dope German industrial designer. Just make a really cool front arm cover or I don't know.
Next version.
Version. There would be some dope things that you could do with wearable products like this.
Right.
That are vibration oriented. I can imagine a calf sleeve, right? That's the vibration is spread completely. Or of course it would depend on, but there's and then I was thinking, okay, not wearable drugs, but maybe wearable psychedelics, right? You catalyze, you kind of jump on this trend because psychedelics are about to become very trendy.
Right.
They are in fact.
It's happening
at the moment.
It's happening.
And I don't think we've reached peak trend yet.
For sure not.
No.
Yeah. But
it's also not a trend because this is always the both and paradox. It also is a wisdom and a lineage that we've held for tens of thousands of years.
Right. It's something.
So it's trendy and it's definitely not trendy.
It will come in phases, right? And this may not be
mushrooms.
Yeah, this may not exactly like things that grow in the seasons, right? There will be a cycle. And it will, what will happen this time around will happen. And then hopefully it just continues to grow in our sense of knowledge and wisdom and ways to provide better lives for each other and ourselves, and continues to gain, to give us fulfilling experiences. But I think the main idea to take home about psychedelics and and all the tools that we have access to, Apollo and all these other things, meditation, mindfulness, deep breathing, float tanks, is that these are all like really incredible tools for helping us to access states of higher meaning, but they have to be used properly. They will not always be guaranteed to give you overwhelmingly positive experiences if they are misused, and some of these are extremely powerful medicines. And one thing I admire about the work you've done, Paul, is that you put together this incredible database for people to actually access information that's, from scientific peer-reviewed journals about, and as much as you could, get in there, that explains to people the origins of these medicines and where they come from and why they've been used the way they're used, and in a lot of cases how to use them properly. And that's so important that people understand that these are powerful medicines that need to be used correctly. Using them at a rave, as fun as it might be for some people, can also be a terrifying experience.
There's a lot more risk.
There's a lot of risk, and people don't talk about that because it's all about, for a lot of people, the recreational side, it's all about escape, and it's like about,
even if it isn't, right? Even if clubbing is this ritual, it's this experience, but I totally get your point, because that's the perception. Even if it's not necessarily the reality.
Right.
Although in some cases it is.
Right. And there are people, I like to dance as much as the next guy, and my wife and I will go out and we will dance as therapy for ourselves.
Have you been to Burning Man?
We have not been to Burning Man yet, but we have some amazing dance clubs in Pittsburgh with incredible house music, and we will go out, when we have time, which is rare, but it does happen, and we'll just dance for like 4 hours to house music, funky house music, and it is so therapeutic, and it just gets so much energy out that sometimes it's hard to get out in other ways.
I tried five rhythms the other day,
but that is an altered state experience.
It is
for us.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah.
So you can access these things in lots of different ways.
Expanded states of consciousness. Sweat lodges are another one. Breath work, float tanks. This is also what I've been thinking more and more about is we opened Synthesis last year, this retreat center in the Netherlands, which for our listeners, go there, go check it out. It's awesome. So we worked on that project last year, and really the vision for that was what does the future center look like that does mind, body, spirit healing? So not only what does that specific center look like, meaning there's a float tank in it, meaning there's comfortable individual rooms to do therapy, meaning there's a couple group rooms, one for smaller sessions 10 to 12 people, one for larger sessions 30 to 40 people. You probably have dope ambient lighting, surround sound Sonos surround sound. The place that we have in the Netherlands is in an old church built in 1928, renovated, and it's fucking awesome, dude. So this is what the future of those looks like, and then what industry grows out of that. That's as well that what we've been thinking about. It's before the 1960s, personal trainers weren't a thing because most people didn't go to gyms, and then Arnold Schwarzenegger came around and gyms became a thing, and now the personal training industry is a $15 billion a year industry.
Right. And the stuff we're talking about is exactly like that. That's a great analogy. I mean, what we're talking about is fitness training for your brain and your emotions and your spirit.
Yeah.
It is bodybuilding for the other parts of the body that we have been taught to ignore or just forgotten about for a long time. And
soul retrieval.
That's one way to describe it. That's a little intense for me, actually, but
my business partner and I joke around about how we're, it's going to be the third wave. We've been trying to think of a slogan, the third wave, the soul retrievers. Something like that.
That's deep.
It's gotta be. Yeah,
that's really deep.
What is soul retrieval? We just it's one of those, to me, one of those words that you read on CIIS's website where you go
yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, when I think about it in the context of MDMA, I think MDMA therapy, the one that's currently in phase 3 trials for PTSD with the FDA, is that trauma can lead us when we're not, and the real tragedy of trauma oftentimes is not actually the trauma itself, it's the support we have after. And that's when the trauma really has an opportunity to be grieved over properly and allow healing to occur very, very rapidly in that first couple months after it happens. And if that's not done, or there's the opposite, which is neglect or people blaming the victim for what happened, which happens all the time, then you get this PTSD effect. But the PTSD effect is very complicated and affects lots of parts of our lives because in large part what it is, it's a chronic stress state that's caused by us shutting out and parts of ourselves that we believe don't serve us anymore, whole chunks of ourselves, positive and negative, chunks of our personality. Imagine something that you did or thought that was a part of your personality you identified with being kind, and giving
Mm-hmm.
and being a good listener. Those skills led you to be traumatized as a child time and time again by your parents, right? And then what happens is you decide one day that those parts have only led to pain for the last few years, and you haven't learned
those parts.
fuck those parts of my personality.
Yeah.
I'm not going to value those as skills anymore. And so you effectively shut out those parts of who you are. And in some cases, people forget how to use those skills, except for the purpose of survival. They basically forget how to empathize with other people, how to be compassionate for themselves, how to be loving and caring with others. And then that cycle of trauma just continues to repeat itself because they treat somebody else like crap.
Right.
As a result, totally unintentionally. And we see it all the time in our patients. And it's totally avoidable because once you work with somebody and give them the opportunity. Everybody wants to heal from this. Everybody is in pain with this, who has it. People are in pain every single day of their lives. Emotional pain in the brain is almost completely indistinguishable from physical pain. These are the same thing. And these emotional wounds fester for years and years and years. In the case of the MDMA study, which makes it so incredible, the average person who had PTSD in that study had it for 17 years.
I know, it's fucking nuts.
And then 5 years later, something like 60% of them are still symptom-free with just 3 doses. With just 3 doses, they're still symptom-free.
And major psychotherapy.
Major psychotherapy for 12 weeks, but not necessarily much afterwards.
Really?
A lot of those people did not have a ton of therapy afterwards,
No?
and they did not take medicine. They did not go back to taking medicine.
No?
No. They'd learn skills from that intensive 12-week session, or a 12-week protocol with just 3 doses. They ingrained and retrained their brain through this work with skilled integration therapists to take knowledge from that and actually continue to integrate it into their lives over time, such that 2 years after the study finished, more people were symptom-free than were a year before. Why? You never expect that with somebody stopping a treatment in Western medicine traditionally. But the reason that happens is because we've actually taught these people some skills. We've gotten them into a state of mind where they've reinvigorated a sense of complete self-empowerment and an openness of human potential. And going back to the idea that you are just you and you're not the emotional, complex, moody version of you that everybody else may see you as or you see you as, because you were taught to see yourself that way. You were just you.
The whole focus of integration is wholeness.
Right.
Right.
And creating new patterns. You know, when you hear the word default mode network, does that sound like something that you want to be in?
No. You don't want to be in a default. You don't
Why
want
would
to
you
be
ever
on
wanna be in-
autopilot.
Right. Unless you have to be there to do something.
Sometimes it's necessary. Like there's a reason that mechanism developed. But what I've noticed is when I've been in a really good state of being, like mental well-being, which hasn't been often in my life, I would say, you know, for most of my early years I was, until I was probably 11 or 12. And then I was probably depressed from the age of like 12 or 13 until, I was 21 or 22.
Yeah, it's really common.
Which is, I think, quite par for the course for most, especially most more like emotional feminine men who grew up in the 90s, early 2000s. You know, it's just, there's a lot of...
It's sensitive. Just being a sensitive man or a man who values feminine traits in any way. God forbid we value the balance of our masculine and feminine traits. Right. But yeah, we were punished for that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Just stigmatized and a lot of shame.
Yeah.
But then I started working with psychedelics in, I would say, a somewhat recreational capacity. But also, I was also someone who, you know, I read voraciously throughout like my childhood. I was always like quite reflective. I recognized patterns. You know, I played soccer for most of my life. I could just see things and anticipate things before they happen, right? So I did a lot of work on myself with that. But at the same time, at some point, I just reached this limit where it's like, I don't now have the capacity to do this on my own. This is where I now feel the need to reach out to a therapist and to reach out to mentors and to reach out to coaches, you know, like who can then take me farther along this process. And I think that's an important element then of healing and transformation and general development.
We need mentors.
Is mentors and
role
people,
models.
Elders, right? So the way that it's often talked about in the psychedelic space is elders.
And the science space is mentors. They mean the same thing, basically.
Right. So it's now like, how do we build and develop that ecosystem? What does that look like? You know, what's the actual infrastructure that needs to be developed to create this new world, this new story? You know, I love the way that Charles Eisenstein puts it. He talks about this concept of the new story of humanity, right? Like, what does it look like to build a world where we recognize that the separation of the self is an illusion, and that we are in fact deeply connected to everything around us. And because of that, we have the responsibility, the requirement to like take care of that, to treat not only ourselves with compassion, forgiveness, self-love, but also to treat those around us and our environment. And someone put it to me really recently, like how can you just serve the moment every moment? What does that look like? How does that manifest? And just be like mindful of that. Like we're serving the moment every moment.
Right.
And that's again where this practice comes in, the ritual, the technology you're building with Apollo, microdosing, mindfulness meditation. It's bringing us back to the here and now. It's bringing us back to the sense of wholeness, the sense of enough, the sense of completion in a way.
Yeah.
Where it's like we don't need to continue to grasp for things outside of our true self to feel complete or whole, and oftentimes, of course, with our lifestyles, that's been bullshit that we don't need. Physical, literal, like materialist.
Right. And yeah, you make a lot of good points. I think that, and it's a big question. I can't answer. It's hard for me to answer that question as a whole, on the whole. But I think what I can do is I can talk about what we're trying to do practically right now to answer that question our own way.
Yeah. What would be your perspective on that question?
So, I think for me, the way as above, so below. As things that happened in the past repeat themselves, and the patterns, of history oftentimes are they're very commonly repeated, and so it's important for us to see those patterns. If we don't see the patterns, we're missing the whole point of learning history and the purpose of observation, right? And so we see the patterns, we learn from the patterns, we make better decisions because of the patterns, and so ultimately those patterns we know from the trauma work of Rachel Yehuda. We know that when those patterns are more traumatizing than not, they get encoded on the DNA in the epigenetics, right? And ultimately, I'm sorry, I should go back. The part of the reason why this stuff is important is because doctors are trained, physicians in the Western world are trained to recognize patterns. That's what we do. That's diagnosis. Right there, clear and simple. Really, really complicated decision trees. That's what we do as doctors. That's what we're trained to do for all the years that we're in training. And that's what makes us good. When we get good at that, we get really, really good at being diagnosticians and executing the right treatment within a timely fashion. And that's what saves lives. However, those doctors in our culture they don't necessarily realize it, but we as doctors serve in an elder role for our society. So there aren't elders anymore the way that the tribal people used to see it on a world level or on a national level. But there are doctors who swear on an oath to take care of people and do what's right for the world and for their patients and for humankind. Nobody else has to take that oath pretty much. And so because of that oath and because the way that doctors have been trained,
the Hippocratic Oath.
The Hippocratic Oath, yeah, which could probably use a little bit of an updating, but we'll
generally
get back
what's
to
the gist of the Hippocratic Oath?
So the Hippocratic Oath is, beneficence, always doing things with your patient's best interests at heart, autonomy, making sure that your patient has the autonomy and ultimately informed consent to be able to make decisions on their own. And respecting that autonomy, and then I think one of the most important parts is non-maleficence, which is do no harm, and that's the part that we've really forgotten the most in our culture because we forget the way that harm can be conveyed to a patient. We forget how important language is. When you diagnose somebody with a chronic illness, and there's a chance that illness could get better if they change something, maybe you don't know what that is. But if there is any chance that could get better and you tell that person when they respect you as much as they do that they have something that's never going to get better, you best believe that they're going to trust you.
Yeah.
And they're going to give up.
Yeah.
They're just going to give up. And when you as a doctor hand somebody an opioid narcotic and you don't educate them properly as to how that medicine is supposed to be used, which is for acute pain only for the first week after treatment, and then you throw those things out afterwards, you don't use them regularly. If you don't educate somebody about that and they go home and they get addicted to that stuff because they don't know how it works because they saw you in a white coat handing them that pill prescription, that's your bad.
Yeah.
That's doing harm, guys.
Yeah.
Like everything from the words to the way that we interact with people is doing harm. And so so we need to change the way that we see health and public health all the way down to the words that we use when we interact with people in a healthcare setting. Healthcare is not a capitalist business. It is a common good that we all want and we all need for survival, unfortunately. And it needs to be available. And all the most successful countries in the world have it for a reason. It's no surprise. It's just something that we need to have available so that we can feel safe in our own skin, in our own country, in our community, and not be worried all the time about whether or not we're going to get hurt, or it just adds to the chronic stress of everything. And so what that comes down to is ultimately that the trauma that was studied in these studies we talked about earlier, there is a connection between the elders of the past and the doctors of now, in that they have a dramatic way to influence society and how we behave on a public health level. It hasn't been tapped yet because all the doctors and healthcare professionals are very divided in their own segmented groups, and they don't talk that much. But ultimately, we have the capacity to do it, and we know so it's about bridging the gap between mind, body, and spirit. And for me, on a science level, it's about the way we do that is we figure out by working with doctors and working with Eastern medicine practitioners and tribal medicine practitioners, looking at how psychedelics work on the level of epigenetics. Because trauma is a very powerful, negative, meaningful experience, and MDMA and ayahuasca and psilocybin and all these psychedelics are very, very powerful, positive experiences. Both of them are present experiences that facilitate the recording of intense amounts of meaning onto the DNA that could be positive or negative or neutral, but it's all part of the same kind of experience. It's part of the pattern, right? And so what we're doing with MAPS, and my colleague Ben Kalmendi at Yale, and Rael Khan at USC, and Joe Tafur, who's one of the leading ayahuasca experts. We have 3 psychiatrists, and Joe, a family med doc, who's also an ayahuasca expert from Peru. And Joe's had incredible experiences and helped a ton of people with this stuff. And so we all got together and we had shared this common vision that it is likely that epigenetic change that is caused by trauma is being reversed by the positive, meaningful experiences people have with psychedelics. And we can actually measure it with psychedelics because people who use psychedelics sometimes just one time will have benefit that lasts years. And for that to occur, that means that there has to be some recorded change in the body somewhere on a DNA level or a protein level, because nothing else lasts in the body for that long. Everything else gets turned over.
Sure.
And so and we know that's how memories are formed thanks to Eric Kandel's work, is on the protein level. And so we just took it one step further and went back to the DNA, and on the DNA, which is constantly changing all the time thanks to Rachel's work. And now we know that we have good evidence to believe that when we start sampling these people who are going through the MDMA treatment for PTSD before and after, and we start sampling their DNA for people who are going through psilocybin for depression and OCD, and people who are going through ayahuasca in traditional Shipibo ayahuasca ceremony, and when we start to sample all these different groups with different psychedelics, what we're going to see is we hypothesize, and we have good reason to believe what we're going to see is that there's going to be similar changes to the DNA in all situations. Why? Because when you really get down to it, these psychedelic medicines, they all basically work the same way. And they all, when they really help people, are focused on treating trauma, and trauma is encoded on the epigenetic code. So if we can see anything similar between any of these compounds, then what it will show for the first time, scientifically proven in a clinically validated controlled study of a ton of people, is that it's not the drug, guys. It's the fact that you curated a ceremony of intention and belief and used the drug to flip on and catalyze that experience of building new meaning. The drug is
basically bringing them
tool.
into a expanded state. You're bringing them into a state where there can be more meaning derived from, just like the lower states, like you were saying with trauma, like when you for example, trauma at war, that's going to be so intense, it will encode.
Right.
And basically what we're doing with psychedelics is we're trying to flip the switch so that instead of it being a really negative intensity, it's a very positive intensity. And as a result of that, helps us to feel safe, helps us to feel secure, helps us to feel, like present.
We're talking about the epigenetic study and really looking at the interface between science and spirit by understanding the impact of medicine and the power of belief and intention in your healing experiences. And the idea that the relationship with your doctor has now been shown to be extraordinarily important for people to recover from things like depression and anxiety disorders and other disorders as well. Because when your doctor smiles at you and looks you in the eye and actually gives you the impression that they're giving you the presence of the moment to interact with you, the presence of time, of their very, very busy schedule, to sit there, even if it's just for 5 minutes and they're making eye contact and they're looking at you like they care, you leave there feeling so much better than you do if he's sitting there looking, or she is sitting there looking and writing in a notebook the entire time. And that's just the way it is. Even if they give you, and what's amazing is even if they give you the right treatment, when they're looking in the notebook and they give you a placebo and they look you in the eye, you do better when they look you in the eye and give you placebo.
Really?
For depression, yeah. And this was a study done at Austin Riggs. It's an incredible study. But this is known. So we should be changing our behavior and learning from things like psychedelics and Apollo as tools and adapting, because that's when you really break it down, adaptation is our single biggest strength as humans.
First principles.
Yes. First principles is we are adapters. We were evolved to be adapters. Look at where we sit in the food chain. Look at where we sit in the world today. Look at everything and how magnificent it is what we've built, for good and for bad. This is incredible. It's an incredible time for us. The technology is incredible. Our potential is completely unknown. And we need to remember always that we were born to adapt for positive, for the survival of humanity and of the earth as a single entity, a single organism that works, they all parts require each other for survival in the way that it is now, you know? So we have to remember that we are more similar than we are different and work together to survive with the earth, with each other.
Gaia.
With ourselves. It's all part of it.
It's all part of it.
That's, I mean, look at Judeo-Christian religion. Our key word in Judaism is one. One is everything. One is not one God outside of ourselves. One is one. It's oneness within ourselves and within everything that balances the duality of everything else that seems to appear all the time. These things have to balance each other to give you this. Like you said, default mode is good for some things, not good for wanting to expand your consciousness.
No.
What if we could train ourselves to turn that default mode network on or off at any moment? That's what the most skilled meditators do. Yeah. You can see it with an EEG brainwave scanner now. You can see their brains change within minutes, sometimes sooner. They've just trained themselves to do it. We can all do that.
We can all do that. And that gives us agency, that empowers us, that feels like, you know, there's not something happening to us, but that we're really manifesting. We're creating meaning in the world.
Exactly.
Right? We're moving with forward progress. That's the human condition.
Yep.
To remain present and content while still striving for greater.
Yep. But we got to keep trying, because if you don't keep trying, you don't keep practicing, you're never going to get good at it. You're going to get good at some other stuff that doesn't really matter.
Right.
And that's really what it comes down to.
Or that doesn't lead to a higher quality of life. Or
right. That doesn't get you to your goal. I mean, when I say matter, I'm not trying to demean anything like that, but just the idea that everybody has their goals and everybody has the things that they care about. And if you're doing stuff and spending your time thinking or feeling or doing things, you know, physically that are things that are not giving you that goal, they're not getting you closer to where you want to be, that's a sign that you should be doing it in a different way. It doesn't mean that your goal's wrong. It means that you're receiving information that's telling you that maybe you need a different approach. Listen to the signs. You know, those signs will guide you along your path to your goal and to manifest what you are seeking, but you have to practice and you have to be patient. And that's actually one of the most important parts about those 4 pillars we were talking about earlier. First, for the first rules, you know, that gratitude, forgiveness, and compassion, self-love. People forget that compassion is patience first. That is one of the most difficult things to master.
It is, yeah.
Is patience for yourself. Just to allow things to unfold at the speed with which they will, and give it a little boost when you can, but also understand that you're not in control of everything. You're in control of the things you're in control of, which is a constant, which it's another part of our path to identify those things and then to give it a little boost when we can and help things move along when we can and facilitate the goal.
But don't get burned out. Don't take it too serious, you know.
Yeah. I mean, don't spend all your time resisting what actually matters and what actually is trying to get you to your goal. We spend so much time just getting distracted by all these other things like money and cars and houses and we've forgotten about the things that really matter, like having meals together and friendship and having opportunities when you can hang out with your friends and family and just talk, like really like what we're talking right now, honestly and openly about how you feel about something without worrying about being judged for who you are because you feel bad about something, or you feel really good about something. You want to share that experience. Like we should be, like that was the community that we had in the ancient days that's unfortunately been lost over time. And we've forgotten, because we've automated a lot of the things that we thought we needed, we've forgotten how to connect with each other on that level. And so it's really important. Those skills are always there. They're natural. When somebody gives you a hug, you always feel good pretty much. It doesn't matter if you haven't had a hug in 50 years. Right. Like it probably feels a whole lot better if you hadn't had a hug in 50 years.
I imagine.
And so it's important to nurture, recognize, and not deny, but really truly nurture these parts of ourselves that are there for a reason, evolutionarily. And when we nurture them, what we find is that we tap into and awaken that opportunity to start to realize what we actually can be and who we can be as people.
That's a good way to end things. Dr. Dave Rabin, where can we find out more information about you? Like what websites?
I mean, you can always go to my LinkedIn, or you can go to, I'm on Twitter at Dave Rabin. And, but if you want to find out the most exciting stuff of what we're doing is on apolloneuroscience.com or apolloneuro.com. And you can also check out more information on the epigenetics study that we're doing with MAPS at modernspirit.org. Modern Spirit is a not-for-profit organization, and we collaborate with the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, which is also a not-for-profit, to raise money to study these medicines for the good of humanity and to try to help people heal in new ways. And if anybody listening has ever fundraised for anything like this, it's always difficult. So we appreciate anything that you can do to help support this cause, as big or small. They are tax-deductible donations, and we do this to help support our understanding of how to use these medicines in better ways to heal ourselves and to heal the world. So we appreciate it.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today. What a beautiful interview. What a beautiful day to do it. I mean,
it is such a beautiful day.
This has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed this, Dave.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul.